What if the whole shape of your life turned on one stranger, on one cold night, deciding to look at you when nobody else would? Not rescue you, not fix you, just look at you and pull out a chair. Quill Creek, Montana Territory, February of 1884, and the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot like a floorboard. Selah Vance stood 3 steps inside the door of the Blue Elk saloon, her crutch braced under her left arm, the jointed wooden leg beneath her skirts settling careful and slow on boards slick with melted boot snow. And she watched a room full of men discover, all at once, that they had somewhere else to look. Nobody stopped talking. That was the thing about Quill Creek. The talk never stopped. It simply closed up around her like water over a dropped stone. 22 men in that room, 11 empty chairs. Not one of them offered. She had come for money she was owed, nothing more. $9.40 for 6 weeks of bread and dried apple pies delivered to the Pike Freight Company's cook shack, and Cornelius Pike's clerk, a soft-handed young man named Dove Abelman, counted the coins onto the wet bar top instead of into her open palm. Slid them across with 2 fingers, the way a man pays out something he'd rather not touch. She looked at the coins. She looked at her own hand, still open, still waiting, and she made herself close it. And then a chair scraped back in the corner, and the sound went through that room like a rifle shot. He was tall, and he stood the way tall men stand when they've spent their lives ducking through low doorways. Dark beard trimmed close, elk-hide coat gone shiny at the elbows. Snow still melting in the crown of his hat where he'd set it on the table. He pulled out the second chair. He didn't smile. He didn't look sorry for her, which was the first mercy anyone in that town had shown her in 2 years. "Sit with me," he said, and the Blue Elk went quiet in an entirely different way than it had a moment before. If Selah and this stranger have already got hold of you, and I think they have, a like helps this story find the next person who needs it. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. Now, let me tell you why nobody in Quill Creek would look at that woman. She sat, partly because refusing meant standing in that doorway even longer, mostly because his face had not asked her to be grateful. "Amos Rennick," he said. "I pack freight over the notch, mules mostly." "Selah Vance." She waited for the question. There was always a question, and it was never the same one twice, and it always came dressed up as friendliness. "Where are your people from? How'd it happen? Do you manage all right on the stairs?" It didn't come. "They stiff you on purpose," he said instead, nodding at the coins she'd swept into her coat pocket. "Or is that clerk just too green to know how to pay a debt?" "He knows," she said. "He'd just rather not have his fingers touch mine while he does it." Amos Rennick considered that for a moment, turning his glass a slow quarter turn on the table. "Then he's a coward," he said, "and a poor hand at arithmetic besides. He counted you short 40 cents. Selah went still, because she had counted it too, standing right there at the bar with her hand open and her face perfectly calm, and she had decided not to make a scene about 40 cents in a room that already wished she'd leave. She had swallowed it the way she'd swallowed 100 smaller things. "You counted that," she said slowly, "from across the room, upside down." "I counted the sound," he said. "Different coins, different ring." He shrugged, and for the first time something like humor moved through his face. "Man packs supplies over a mountain for a living. He learns to hear when a load's light." And Selah Vance, who had not laughed out loud in a public room in 2 full years, laughed out loud in a public room. Her father had been a schoolteacher, not the kind with a college behind him, the kind who learned his letters after emancipation, at 26 years old, by candle and by stubbornness, and then spent the rest of his life handing them out to anyone who'd sit still long enough to take them. He'd carried his family out of Kentucky to Nicodemus, Kansas, in the great exodus of '79, into a town of sod houses and prairie wind and folks who had come west for the simple, blazing reason that the land there did not belong to anybody who had ever owned them. He taught Selah her sums at the kitchen table. He taught her that a column of figures never lied and never flattered and never once cared what a person looked like, which made a ledger the most honest room she had ever stood in. She was 19 when he died, and 24 when she took the last of her mother's egg money and rode a stage north into the mountains, because somebody in Nicodemus had heard the mining camps paid a cook 4 times what a Kansas kitchen would. They did. For 11 months, they did. The slide came down on a Tuesday morning in April, above the Ashcroft workings, when the spring sun had been working 3 straight days on a snowpack that had spent all winter waiting for exactly that. It took the cook shack sideways off its footings, with Selah still inside it, and packed the snow in so tight she could not turn her head. And she lay in the blue dark, with one arm free and her right leg pinned wrong beneath a beam, listening to men shout her name in the wrong place. They found her in 4 hours. The camp doctor took the leg below the knee 8 days later, when the frostbite made the argument for him. Nobody called her brave. There was nothing brave in it. She had simply been standing where the mountain decided to come down, and she had lived, and living had cost her a leg, and that, she came to understand, was the trouble. A town can love a hero. It knows exactly what to do with one. It brings pie. But a woman who is only unlucky? A woman who is unlucky, and black, and alone, and walks into the mercantile with a crutch and a wooden leg and a face that will not do anyone the courtesy of looking ashamed? Quill Creek had no idea what to do with her at all. So it decided, quietly, together, without one word ever spoken out loud, to simply manage her instead. She baked. She sold bread and dried apple pies to the freight company and the boarding house. She kept to her own door. And on Sundays, when the Ladies' Aid met in the church basement to plan the spring dance, nobody ever thought to tell her the time. Amos Rennick was 31, and he had not sat at a table with a woman in 6 years. He came down off the notch every 2 weeks with a string of 9 mules, sold his freight, bought his beans and his lamp oil, and went back up. He kept a cabin at 8,000 feet with a stove and a rifle and 1 chair. 6 years ago he had chosen a route. His brother Isaac, 19, had ridden it behind him, and the slope above the switchback had let go, and Amos had spent 2 days digging with a broken shovel and his bare hands into snow gone hard as church stone, and he had found him, and it had made no difference at all. There is a particular thing that happens to a man after that. He does not stop working. He does not drink himself down. He simply, carefully, arranges his whole life so that nobody will ever again be standing where he told them to stand. 1 chair, 1 cabin. 9 mules who did not require him to be good, only to be on time. He had come into the Blue Elk that night because it was warm, and he had taken the corner table because he always did, and he had not planned to say a single word to anybody. Then he watched a room full of men refuse to see a woman standing in a doorway, and he was already up out of the chair before he had finished deciding to be. They talked for an hour. Mule prices, the trouble with green packers, a story about a Jenny named Wren who had once thrown 100 pounds of flour into a creek out of what Amos insisted was pure spite. Ordinary talk, the kind that assumes a person is a person and not a situation. When Selah stood to go, he stood too, and he did not offer her his arm, because she had not asked for it, and he seemed to understand that the offering itself would have been a kind of verdict. But at the door he stopped, and he pulled a battered leather book from inside his coat, and he set it on the table between them like a man laying down something heavier than it looked. "My tally book," he said. 6 months of hauling for Pike Freight. Every load, every weight, every payout. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know how to read a mountain, Miss Vance. I can't read a column of figures worth a damn." And I've had a feeling in my gut since November that somebody in that office is stealing from me. And I can't prove it, and I'm tired of feeling stupid about it. Selah looked down at the book. "You want me to find it," she said. "I want to know if there's anything to find. There's $1 in it for you either way." He hesitated. 40 cents of that being what you're already owed, which I intend to go collect. She should have said no. She had spent 2 years learning exactly which rooms were safe, which stairs were worth it, which invitations carried a bill she'd be paying long after everyone else had forgotten they'd handed it to her. She picked up the book. She did not know it yet, but she had just made an enemy of the richest man in Quill Creek. And she had 4 days before he came to her door to tell her so. No one wanted the one-legged girl at the bar, until a lonely mountain man said, "Sit with me." Part 2. The Weight of a Load. She found it on the 3rd night. Selah Vance sat at her kitchen table with Amos Rennick's tally book open under a lamp turned low to save oil, a stub of pencil in her fingers, and the whole silent weight of a mountain town sleeping around her. And she found it the way her father had taught her to find things. Not by looking for the lie, by looking for the place where the truth got tired. Every load Amos hauled was weighed twice. Once at the Pike Freight Scale House in Quill Creek, once at the mine store up at the Notch, where the company clerk signed for it. 6 months of paired figures marching down the page in Amos's blunt, careful hand. They matched. Every one of them matched. Except that in November, the difference between the 2 weights had begun, very quietly, to grow. 4 pounds, then 7, then 11. Always in Pike's favor, always small enough to look like a wet tarp, a frozen scale, a man's honest sloppiness with a pencil. Never once in Amos's favor. Not one single time in 140 loads. Selah sat back in her chair, and she felt something she had not felt since the mountain came down on her. She felt useful. All the way through, like a hot stone in her hands. "An honest scale," she said out loud to nobody, "makes mistakes in both directions." He came down off the Notch on a Friday, and she told him. He didn't shout. He sat in her one good chair with his hat on his knee, and he listened while she walked him through it, page by page, her pencil tapping each figure, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. 11 pounds, he said, on a 9-mule string, twice a month, for 6 months. 416 pounds, Selah said, which at your freight rate is $51 and change. She closed the book. "He's not robbing you, Mr. Rennick. He's dieting you. Slow enough you'd never make an accusation, because who accuses a man over 11 pounds? Amos looked at her, really looked, the way a man looks at a mountain he's about to cross. "How'd you learn to do that?" "My father was a school teacher." She shrugged, and something proud and long-buried came up in her voice. "He told me a ledger is the only room in the world where nobody gets to interrupt you." Amos Rennick did not say, "You're clever," or "Ain't that something?" or any of the 50 things men said to her when she surprised them, all of which carried the same small poison underneath. "I did not expect this of you." He said, "Then I'd be a fool to take you off the books. Will you keep them for me? Regular, paid work, not a favor." And Selah, who had been paid in coins dropped on a wet bar top 4 days before, had to look at the table for a second. "Yes," she said, "but I charge more than $1. I'd think less of you if you didn't." The first snow of March came in wet and mean, and it was Amos who noticed what it did to her. He watched her cross Front Street with her crutch punching through the crust, watched her stop twice, watched the small, tight set of her jaw that meant she was doing arithmetic. How many steps? How much ice? How far to a wall I can touch? He said nothing about it. He simply did not come down the following week. When he came the week after, he set a wooden box on her table and stood back from it like it might go off. Inside was a boot, a right boot, alone, built low and wide, its sole studded with 8 caulk nails hammered flat and true. And beneath it, wrapped in flannel, a socket of hard-cured elk hide, stitched double, shaped to fit over the top of her wooden leg where the old canvas wrap had been chewing her stump raw for 2 years. Selah looked at it for a long time and did not touch it. "You'll want to try the fit," Amos said, very carefully. "And I'd rather you cussed me now than in a snowbank in April." She sat. She lifted her skirt to the knee, and she watched his eyes, because she always watched their eyes, and his went where they were supposed to go, to the wood and the leather and the work, and stayed there. He knelt on her kitchen floor. His hands were enormous, rope-scarred across the knuckles, one thumbnail black from a load gone wrong, and they came up under the wooden shin and turned it, gently, the way a man turns a horse's hoof to look at the frog. He fitted the elk hide socket over the top. He pressed the seam flat with the heel of his palm. "Too tight?" "No." "Here?" His thumb moved half an inch. "This is where it rubs, isn't it?" Selah could not answer him, because nobody in 2 years had asked her where it hurt, as though the answer were simply information, as though it were a strap that could be moved, and not a tragedy that had to be tiptoed past. Her hand came down without her permission and rested on the back of his, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the cold still in his skin from the ride down. He went entirely still. Neither of them said anything at all. And then he tightened the last strap and stood and turned away to look out the window at nothing and cleared his throat. "Try it on the ice," he said. "Tomorrow. I'll walk with you." 2 years of being managed, and the first man to touch her leg was the only one who never once looked at it like an apology. If that landed somewhere in your chest, hit that like button and stay with me, because Quill Creek is about to remind Selah exactly where it thinks she belongs. Cornelius Pike owned the freight company, the scale house, the mercantile's mortgage, and, in the general opinion of Quill Creek, most of the opinions. He was 54, a widower, and he had a way of being kind at a person that felt exactly like being measured for a coffin. He came to Selah's door on a Sunday afternoon in a good coat with a tin of English tea in his hand, and he sat in her one good chair, Amos's chair, and he told her that he had been thinking about her situation. "You're a capable woman," he said. "Unusually capable. And I find I'm short a bookkeeper." He set the tea down. "I'm also short a wife. I've no romantic nonsense to offer you, and I'd not insult you by pretending. But I'd offer a roof that doesn't leak, a stove that draws, and a name in this town that would stop folks looking at you the way they look at you." Selah folded her hands. "And what would you be getting, Mr. Pike?" He smiled, pleased, as though she had passed a small test. "A clever woman keeping my books, and keeping them quiet." There it was, not a proposal, a purchase, and a bribe folded inside it, and he had been so certain of the answer that he had brought the tea in advance. "Mr. Pike," Selah said, and her voice came out of her steady and low and entirely her own. "I have been cold. I have been hungry. I have been dropped my own money on a wet bar because a boy didn't want to touch my hand. So I want you to understand that I know exactly what you're offering and exactly what it's worth." She stood on her wooden leg without the crutch in her own kitchen. "I need a good man," she said. "I don't need a rich one. And you have gone to a great deal of trouble to prove to me you're not the first." Cornelius Pike left the tea on the table. He also, within 9 days, canceled her bread order at the cook shack, informed the boarding house that Pike Freight would look unkindly on suppliers who dealt with difficult persons, and let it be known in the church basement, in the Mercantile, in the Blue Elk, that the Rennick Fellows' arrangement with the crippled colored girl was a charity that had gotten out of hand, and that a decent town owed it to the man to say so before he ruined himself. Half of Quill Creek repeated it, not because they believed it, because it was easier than not repeating it. And on the last Tuesday of March, the northbound stage brought Selah Vance a letter from the Territorial Assay Office in Helena, where a Mr. Fry, a friend of a Nicodemus schoolteacher, long dead, required a bookkeeper, wages of $40 monthly, references sufficient, position to be filled by the 1st of May. $40, paid into her hand. In a city big enough that a woman could be a set of figures on a page and nothing else at all. She was still holding the letter and the stage ticket the clerk had sold her that same hour, standing at her open door in the failing light, when she heard the mules coming down Front Street, 9 of them, and a tall man walking at the head of the string, snow in his beard, looking for her window. And Amos Rennick stopped dead in the middle of the road and looked at the ticket in her hand. He didn't ask her to stay. That was the thing that undid her, later, when she went back over it. Amos Rennick stood in the middle of Front Street with 9 mules steaming behind him in the cold, and he looked at the stage ticket in her hand, and whatever went across his face went across it fast and got put away. "Helena?" he said. "Assay office, 40 a month." He nodded slowly. He looked up the street and down it, at the town that had canceled her bread order and emptied its chairs at her, and never once, in 2 years, saved her a seat. "It's more than you're worth here," he said, "which says nothing about you and everything about here." And he touched the brim of his hat, and he walked his string up to the corral, and he did not say one word to make it harder for her. Selah stood in her doorway until the cold got into her bones. That was what he'd learned, up there in his cabin with 1 chair, after 6 years of arranging his life so that nobody would ever again be standing where he told them to stand. He would not tell her where to stand. He would rather lose her clean than hold her by the wrist. And she stood there and thought, "God help me, I do not want to be held by the wrist. I want to be asked." The miners' meeting was held the 2nd Thursday of April in the Oddfellows Hall, and it was called for one dull purpose: to renew Pike Freight's contract on the Notch Road for another year. Selah Vance walked into that hall on a caulked boot and a wooden leg, with no crutch, and a leather tally book under her arm. Nobody offered her a chair. Some things a town does not unlearn in a season. So she stood. And when the chairman asked, out of pure startled politeness, whether the lady had business before the meeting, she said, "I do. It's arithmetic." It took her 11 minutes. She accused nobody of anything. Her father used to say that an accusation is an opinion, but a column of figures is a fact. And a fact sits there being true no matter how loudly a man argues with it. So she simply read out the paired weights. 140 loads, scale house against mine store. And then she said, mildly, "An honest scale errs both ways, gentlemen. This one has erred in one direction, 140 times running. If you'd care to check your own tally books against Pike's, I imagine you'd find your own November was a heavy month." The room went very quiet. Then a placer man named F. Kinnard stood up in the back with his own greasy little book in his fist and said in a voice like a rock slide, "Say that about November again." They didn't run Cornelius Pike out of Quill Creek. It's not that kind of story. What they did was slower and worse for him. They read their own books. They put the scale house under a committee. They renewed his contract at a rate that made him sit down very carefully. And when it was over, the chairman, a nervous man named Ludlow, who had 2 months earlier watched Selah stand in the doorway of the Blue Elk and looked away like everybody else, cleared his throat and said into the silence, "Miss Vance, would you take a chair?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I'd take the work," she said. "I'll stand for the chair." 9 men laughed. It was the first sound of anybody laughing with her in that town in 2 years, and she carried it home in her chest like a coal. The spring dance was held in the same hall 4 nights later, with lanterns strung across the beams and a fiddler down from Butte who was drunk enough to be excellent. Selah didn't intend to go. Amos came for her anyway. He came down off the notch in a shirt so new it still had the fold marks in it, and he stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands like a boy, and he said, "They'll have a floor in there, smooth boards, no ice. And I know for a fact that a waltz is only 3 steps, and I only ever learned 2 of them, so we'd be starting even." "Amos, I'm not asking you to prove anything to them," he said. "I've got no interest in what they see. I'd just like to dance with you, and this is the only room in 50 miles that's got a fiddler in it." She went. He put his hand at her waist and took her right hand in his left, and he did the thing he had been quietly doing since February, which was to adjust himself to her without ever once announcing that he was doing it. Shorter steps. Weight held steady through the turns. His whole big frame moving a half-beat early so that she never had to catch up. She braced for the fall through the first turn. Through the second, she braced less. By the third, she was dancing, and she was laughing out loud in a public room, and half of Quill Creek was watching a woman they had spent 2 years managing instead of knowing, and finding, to their considerable discomfort, that they no longer had the words to keep doing it. When the fiddle ran down, he did not let go of her hand right away. "I've got something," he said, "in my coat, and I've been carrying it since March, and I'd rather not carry it back up that mountain again." It was a book. A world atlas, water-stained on the corner, bought second-hand off a Helena freighter and packed over a mountain pass inside a coat. He'd marked one page with a strip of harness leather. Kansas. And on it, in pencil, in his blunt, awkward hand, somebody had drawn a small square where no town was printed, and written beside it, Nicodemus. "You said your father walked there," Amos said. "Seemed to me a thing like that ought to be on a map." Selah Vance stood in a hall full of lantern light with her hand still in his, and she could not speak at all. "One more thing before the end of this, and I hope you'll stay for it. If Selah's father ever taught anybody anything, it's that people are worth exactly what they can do, not what they look like doing it. Leave a comment and tell me who taught you that. I'll be reading. Now let's finish this properly." He asked her at Shepherd's Notch on the 1st of May, on the morning her stage was due to leave. She had ridden up with him to see it, the high saddle of the pass where the whole territory came apart below you in blue and white and endless distance. He'd set her on a steady mare and walked at her stirrup the whole way up. "There's my cabin," he said, pointing. "There's 1 chair in it." "I've heard." "I built it that way on purpose." He was looking out at the mountains, not at her. "I lost my brother on a route I picked, and I decided the safest thing I could do for anybody in this world was never let him depend on me again. Kept that up 6 years. Thought it was wisdom. He turned his head. It wasn't. It was just a very quiet way of being a coward, and I'd have gone on doing it forever if a room full of men hadn't refused to look at you. He took his hat off. His hands were shaking, and he didn't hide it. Selah, I'm not offering you a roof that doesn't leak. It leaks. I'm not offering you a name that'd make this town easier on you. My name won't do that, and I won't insult you by saying it would. He swallowed. I'm offering you a second chair. I'll build it myself, and I'll go down that mountain every 2 weeks and haul freight, and you'll keep the books for half this valley, and I will never once in my life tell you where to stand. The wind came up over the pass. That's not much, he said, but it's mine, and it's honest, and I'd like it to be ours. Selah looked out at the valley, at the town below that had emptied its chairs at her, at the road running south to a city where she could be $40 a month and nobody at all, at the ticket still folded in her coat pocket where it had been for 6 weeks. She left it there. You'll need to make that second chair wide, she said. I sit crooked. Amos Rennick laughed, a great, cracked, unpracticed sound, like a door coming open on a room nobody had gone into in years. And then he kissed her, up there at 8,000 feet, with the whole territory watching and not a soul in it near enough to have an opinion. They were married in June in the Oddfellows Hall because the church basement never did get around to inviting her. 9 men from the Miners Association came. F. Kinnard gave the bride away, badly, and cried harder than anyone. Cornelius Pike did not attend, and by the following spring he had sold his interest in the scale house and gone to Denver, which in a man like that is its own kind of confession. She kept the books for the association, then the mercantile, then half of Quill Creek, and the same men who had once found somewhere else to look now took their hats off in her kitchen and waited while she found the mistake. Because a town can be wrong for 2 years and still be capable of learning if somebody stands still long enough to teach it. 4 years on, there were 3 chairs at the table in the cabin at 8,000 feet, and then 4. The atlas stayed on the shelf, and the boy who came second learned his letters out of it and made his mother point out the little pencil square in Kansas every single time and tell him again about the man who walked there. And sometimes, in the winter, when the wind came down off the notch and the stove was drawing and the ledger was closed for the night, Selah Rennick would look up and find her husband watching her across a warm room, and she would remember standing 3 steps inside the door of a saloon in a town full of empty chairs and the sound of one being pulled out. He never did tell her where to stand. He only ever asked her to sit. Thank you, truly, for riding this one out with me. If it stayed with you, you know what to do, and I'll see you at the next fire.